I didn't make bad choices. That's what hurts the most. Every major decision in my life was reasonable. Thought through. Defensible. The kind of choice you can explain without hesitation when someone asks why you did what you did. I chose stability over uncertainty. Security over impulse. The sensible path over the risky one. Over and over again. At the time, it felt like maturity. Now, it feels like erosion. I used to believe regret came from mistakes. From reckless decisions. From moments where you ignored warning signs and paid the price. No one tells you that regret can also come from always choosing correctly. From building a life that never collapses but never fully opens either. The realization didn't hit me during a crisis. There was no breakdown, no dramatic loss. It happened during a completely ordinary night. I was sitting alone in my car, engine off, rain tapping softly against the windshield. I had just finished another long day of doing everything I was supposed to do. And suddenly, a thought arrived fully formed, without emotion: if this is my life forever, I will survive it but I will never feel it. That sentence scared me more than panic ever could. Because survival had always been my goal. I had built my life around minimizing damage. Avoiding regret. Protecting myself from irreversible mistakes. Ironically, that protection had become the mistake. Looking back, I can trace the pattern clearly. Every time I stood at a crossroads, I asked the same question: which option keeps the most doors open? I believed flexibility was wisdom. But flexibility without commitment turns into drifting. I postponed dreams because they weren't practical yet. I delayed risks because timing never felt perfect. I told myself I was being patient, when in reality, I was being afraid. Afraid of choosing something that couldn't be undone. So I chose the path that could always be justified. I built a career that made sense. Relationships that were safe. A routine that never threatened me. From the outside, it looked like I had everything under control. Inside, I felt increasingly detached. I stopped feeling urgency. Stopped feeling hunger for more. Stopped feeling anything that demanded courage. Life became a sequence of well-managed days. Efficient. Predictable. Quiet. People admired that. They called me grounded. Balanced. Responsible. What they didn't see was how much I was editing myself to maintain that balance. How many impulses I ignored. How many questions I silenced before they reached my mouth. I had learned to live without extremes. Without realizing that extremes are often where meaning lives. There was a time when I used to feel pulled toward things. Toward ideas, people, possibilities that scared me because they mattered. That version of me didn't disappear suddenly. He faded. Each time I chose the safer option, he stepped a little further back. Until one day, I couldn't hear him at all. I told myself that was growth, that passion calms down with age. That excitement gives way to realism. That dreams mature into plans and plans into responsibilities. But realism without desire becomes numbness. And numbness is not peace. I began to notice how often my days felt interchangeable. Mondays bled into Fridays. Months passed without memory markers. Time moved, but nothing inside me moved with it. I wasn't unhappy. I was untouched. That distinction matters. Unhappiness demands change. Being untouched allows you to continue indefinitely. I started to understand why nothing ever pushed me to stop. My life worked too well to trigger alarm. There was no crisis to blame. No villain to point at. No tragedy to justify dissatisfaction. Just a quiet sense that I was living a life designed to be correct, not alive. That night in the car, with rain blurring the world outside, I realized something painful and clarifying at the same time. I had been choosing safety so carefully that I never chose myself. Every right decision had moved me further away from the parts of me that didn't fit neatly into plans. And now, I didn't know how to reach them anymore. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling the weight of all the lives I could have lived, not because they were better, but because they were mine. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question: what if the life I avoided was the one that would have made me feel real? That question didn't give me answers, but it shattered the illusion that doing everything right would eventually feel right. And once that illusion broke, I couldn't keep driving forward on autopilot anymore. Because I finally understood the cost of always choosing the correct life: you never get to know the true one. After that night in the car, I tried to do what I always did when something inside me felt uncomfortable. I tried to rationalize it away. I told myself I was overthinking. That this was just a temporary dip in motivation. That everyone reaches a point where life feels flat, and the responsible thing to do is push through it. So I pushed. I doubled down on structure, on discipline, on doing the right things even more consistently than before. If uncertainty was creeping in, I would suffocate it with order. Order had always been my shield. But this time, it didn't work. The more controlled my days became, the more disconnected I felt. My life ran smoothly, almost flawlessly, and yet I experienced it as if I were reading instructions rather than living moments. I noticed how little risk remained in my choices. Nothing surprised me anymore. Nothing challenged me. Nothing demanded courage. Everything fit neatly into the person I was expected to be. I began to see how carefully I had curated my life to avoid loss. I avoided paths that could fail publicly. I avoided relationships that could destabilize me. I avoided desires that didn't come with guarantees. At some point, avoidance became my personality. People trusted me because I was predictable. They knew how I would respond, what I would choose, what I would not allow myself to want. I wore that predictability like proof of maturity. Inside, I felt like a ghost of my own potential. I started to grieve things I had never lost because I had never allowed myself to have them. Lives I had imagined briefly, then dismissed as unrealistic. Versions of myself that required faith instead of logic. The grief was strange. There was no funeral. No clear ending. Just a quiet sadness that accompanied me everywhere, like background noise I couldn't turn off. I realized how much of my identity was built on not wanting too much. Wanting too much felt irresponsible. Dangerous. Like an invitation to disappointment. So I learned to want very little. I convinced myself that contentment was about lowering expectations. That peace came from shrinking your desires until they fit neatly into reality. But what I had created wasn't peace. It was resignation. I began noticing how often I felt irritated when people talked about passion or reinvention. Their words made me uncomfortable because they reminded me of something I had buried. Not envy. Recognition. They were naming something I had deliberately avoided. I saw how often I framed my past choices as inevitable. As if there had never been alternatives. As if I had simply followed the only available path. That was another lie. There had always been other options. I just hadn't chosen them. Not because I couldn't but because I didn't trust myself to survive the consequences. I feared regret so deeply that I structured my entire life around avoiding it. And in doing so, I created a deeper kind of regret, the regret of never knowing what could have been. That realization made everything heavier. It was easier to believe in fate than to admit fear. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. When was the last time I felt fully alive? When was the last time I chose something that scared me because it mattered? When did I stop believing I could recover from mistakes? The answers pointed to the same moment, not a date, but a shift. The moment I began valuing correctness over truth. Correctness kept me safe. Truth would have required courage. I noticed how often I delayed decisions by saying I needed more information. More time. More certainty. Those delays were never about preparation. They were about avoidance. I was waiting for a future version of myself who would be braver than I was. That version never arrived. Because bravery doesn't come from waiting. It comes from acting while afraid. One evening, I caught myself thinking, at least I didn't ruin my life. The thought felt hollow. Because I realized something devastating, a life can remain intact and still be ruined quietly, politely, without visible damage. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply refused to engage fully. That meant there was no dramatic moment to point to, no single mistake to forgive myself for. Just a long series of careful choices that added up to absence. I began to feel anger, not explosive, but steady. Anger at myself for mistaking fear for wisdom. For calling inaction patience. For assuming that time would eventually reward my caution. Time doesn't reward caution. It just passes. I felt the weight of the years I had spent choosing safety as if it were neutral. Years where I could have tried, failed, learned, adjusted. Instead, I had perfected survival. Survival is impressive. It's just not enough. I started to sense that something would have to give. Either I would continue living a life that made sense on paper and felt empty in practice, or I would risk stepping into something unproven, imperfect, and undeniably mine. The fear of the second option was intense. But for the first time, the fear of the first option was worse. That was new. And it meant the balance I had relied on for years was finally breaking. I didn't know yet how I would change my life. But I knew this with absolute clarity: choosing the right life had cost me my voice. And if I didn't act soon, I might forget how to hear it at all. The decision didn't arrive as courage. It arrived as exhaustion. Not the kind you fix with sleep, the kind that comes from constantly silencing yourself. From carrying a life that looks correct but feels foreign. From pretending that the absence of pain means the presence of meaning. I didn't wake up one morning and choose chaos. I chose honesty. And honesty dismantled everything I had built to avoid discomfort. The first thing I let go of was justification. I stopped explaining my choices as if they needed permission. Stopped framing my doubts as temporary phases. Stopped telling myself that wanting something different was a flaw in my character. That was harder than it sounds. For years, I had survived by making my life defensible. Every decision had an argument behind it. A reason. A logic chain that proved I was being responsible. Letting go of that felt reckless. But something unexpected happened. Without the constant need to defend my life, I could finally hear myself think. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but it was real. I started making choices that didn't look impressive. Choices that didn't optimize for safety or approval. Choices that didn't guarantee success. Small ones at first. Saying no without replacing it with an excuse. Walking away from paths that no longer felt alive. Allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to fix it. Each choice felt like stepping onto unstable ground. But I noticed something important. Even when I was afraid, I felt present. I hadn't felt that in years. Presence didn't make me happier. It made me accountable. There was no one left to blame. No system to hide behind. No narrative of doing the right thing to protect me from regret. Every step forward belonged to me. That was terrifying. And freeing. I began to understand that the life I had built wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. It had been designed to minimize loss, not to invite experience. To preserve order, not to allow growth. I had mistaken correctness for meaning. Meaning doesn't come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from engaging with consequence. There were days when regret hit hard. When I looked back at the years I had spent choosing safety and felt the weight of lost time. Time I could never reclaim. Versions of myself that would never exist. I didn't try to erase that regret. I let it stay. Because regret, when faced honestly, doesn't paralyze you. It clarifies you. It shows you exactly where you stopped listening. I realized that my greatest fear had never been failure. It had been responsibility. Responsibility for choosing a life that couldn't be justified to everyone else. Responsibility for outcomes I couldn't explain away as the sensible option. I had been afraid of owning my life fully. Now, I had no choice. The world didn't reward me for changing. There was no applause. No moment of recognition. Some people didn't understand. Some quietly disappeared. Some assumed I was going through something I would eventually grow out of. I let them think that. Because for the first time, my life didn't need to be legible to others. It only needed to be honest to me. Over time, something subtle shifted. Time stopped slipping through my hands unnoticed. Days gained texture. Even difficult moments felt grounded instead of hollow. I stopped asking whether my choices were right. I asked whether they were mine. That question changed everything. I no longer chased certainty. I accepted that uncertainty was the price of living consciously. That fear doesn't disappear when you choose yourself, it just stops making decisions for you. I learned that safety is not the absence of risk. It's the absence of self-betrayal. Looking back now, I don't condemn the version of myself who chose the right life. He was trying to protect me. He believed that correctness would eventually lead to peace. He didn't know that peace requires participation. If you're listening to this and you feel that quiet emptiness, not despair, not crisis, just the sense that your life is happening around you, listen carefully. You can do everything right and still lose yourself. You can avoid every mistake and still miss your life. And you can survive indefinitely without ever feeling alive. Choosing yourself doesn't mean rejecting everything you built. Sometimes it just means admitting that what once protected you is now holding you back. I didn't ruin my life by choosing differently. I ruined parts of it by choosing correctly for too long. Now, even when I'm uncertain, even when the future feels fragile, there is one thing I no longer feel absent. I am here. In my choices. In my mistakes. In my unfinished life, and after years of doing everything right, being here fully, imperfectly, honestly, is the first decision that finally feels true.